Maria had worked for us for 6 years, long enough to know the sound of my footsteps before I opened the door, long enough to know which mug I wanted my coffee in on stressful mornings and which playlist I hummed along to while unloading the dishwasher on Sunday nights. She'd started as a referral from my mother, a quiet woman in her 50s with careful hands and a habit of remembering small details about our lives. My allergy to lilies, Rachel's preference for lavender detergent, the anniversary of my father's death, which she always marked by leaving a small vase of white flowers on the hall table without ever mentioning why. So when she called my cell phone that Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight and strange, I knew something was wrong before she said a word. I was 3 floors up in a glass conference room, half listening to a vendor pitch about supply chain software, my phone buzzing insistently in my jacket pocket. Maria never called during work hours. In 6 years, she'd called me exactly twice, once when a pipe burst in the guest bathroom, and once when our dog got into the trash and needed an emergency vet run. So when her name flashed across my screen a third time, I excused myself from the meeting with a mumbled apology and stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Daniels," she whispered, like she was hiding in a closet. "Don't go home."
Not yet.
"Maria, what's going on? Is everyone okay?" "Just park down the street.
Please.
Trust me." Her voice had a tremor in it I'd never heard before, something urgent and frightened threaded through every syllable. I asked her again what was wrong, but she'd already hung up, and calling back sent me straight to voicemail. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, watching people walk past with their coffee cups and their normal Tuesday faces, feeling like the floor had tilted slightly beneath me without anyone else noticing. I told my assistant I had a family emergency. I don't think I was lying. The drive home was 35 minutes on a good day, and that afternoon traffic crawled like it wanted to torture me specifically. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to imagine every scenario that made sense. A break-in, a gas leak, something wrong with the house itself, anything that would let Maria's warning be about wood and pipes and property instead of about the 2 people who lived inside it. I turned the radio on and off 3 times. I caught myself running red lights I should have stopped at, my mind refusing to settle on any single fear long enough to examine it. By the time I reached our street, my hands had gone cold on the wheel despite the July heat pressing against the windshield. I slowed the car half a block from our house, the way Maria had told me to, and pulled over beneath the shade of a neighbor's oak tree. From there I had a clear view of our driveway. Rachel's car was there, parked at its usual careless angle. So it was one I didn't recognize, a black sedan with rental plates, the kind of anonymous, forgettable car that could belong to anyone. A delivery driver, maybe. A friend visiting. My mind cycled through a dozen harmless explanations, each one thinner than the last, each one collapsing under its own weight before I could fully believe it. I sat there with the engine off, the car ticking as it cooled, and I watched the front door like it might do something on its own. Swing open, reveal something, offer some kind of explanation before I had to walk toward it myself. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular suburban way, sprinklers hissing somewhere down the block, a dog barking twice and then falling silent. Ordinary sounds for what did not feel like an ordinary afternoon. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that my legs had gone stiff, long enough that the shadow of the oak tree had shifted across the hood of my car. I kept telling myself to just walk up and knock, to end the uncertainty one way or another. But something in Maria's voice had planted itself in me like a splinter, and every time I reached for the door handle, I stopped. Then I saw her, Maria, slipping out through the side gate that led to our backyard, moving quickly, glancing over her shoulder the way people do when they're not sure if they're being watched. She was still in her cleaning apron, the fabric smudged with what looked like dust from the bookshelves she always did on Tuesdays. She spotted my car immediately, as if she'd known exactly where I'd be parked, and she crossed the street toward me with quick, careful steps, checking the house behind her one more time before she reached my window. I rolled it down. She leaned in, and I could see now that her hands were trembling, twisting the fabric of her apron into a tight knot. "I was vacuuming upstairs," she said, her voice low even though we were half a block away and there was no one to overhear us. "I heard voices in your bedroom. I thought maybe you'd come home early, so I looked." I already knew. Some part of me had known for months. In the quiet way you sense a floor is about to give out beneath you long before it actually cracks. The late nights at work, that stretched later than any project should require. The phone that had started living face down on the nightstand. The way Rachel had begun flinching, almost imperceptibly, whenever I reached for her hand at dinner. As if affection had become something she had to brace herself against rather than lean into. I asked her, though I'm still not sure why, as if hearing it out loud would somehow change what it meant. "Who is it, Maria?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw how much she didn't want to be the one to say it, how she'd probably spent the last 20 minutes hiding in the pantry trying to decide whether to call me at all, weighing loyalty against the terrible weight of what she'd witnessed. "It's your business partner," she said finally, barely above a whisper.
Chris.
The name landed like a physical blow, knocking something loose in my chest that I don't think I ever got back into place. Chris, who had sat at our table every Sunday for 2 years, who brought wine he knew Rachel liked and always insisted on doing the dishes afterward. A Chris, who had stood beside me at our wedding in a rented tuxedo, hand steady on my shoulder, who had once told me, half drunk and sincere, that I was the luckiest man alive to have found someone like her. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing, while the entire architecture of the last several years rearranged itself in my mind. Every dinner, every business trip, every casual touch I dismissed as friendship. Maria didn't say anything else. She just stood there beside the car, apron still twisted in her hands, letting the silence stretch out because she seemed to understand, better than I did in that moment, that there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. I didn't storm up to the house. I didn't call anyone, didn't scream, didn't do any of the things I might have imagined myself doing if you'd asked me, in some hypothetical, safely distant conversation, what I'd do if I ever found out my wife was cheating on me. Instead, I opened the car door and sat down on the curb, right there on the sidewalk outside my own home, my knees pulled up like a kid waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Maria sat down beside me without a word, close enough that I could feel she was there, far enough that she wasn't intruding on whatever was happening inside me. The late afternoon sun slanted gold through the oak leaves above us, and somewhere down the street that dog started barking again, and I sat there on the curb outside the life I thought I had, watching it come apart in silence, one quiet piece at a time. I gave it a week before I said anything. A week of watching Rachel move through our kitchen like nothing had shifted beneath her feet, laughing at my jokes, kissing me goodbye in the mornings with her hand resting briefly on my chest, while I carried the truth around like a stone lodged somewhere behind my ribs. I wanted to be sure, not of what I'd seen, or rather what Maria had seen and relayed to me in fragments on a curb outside my own house, but of what I was willing to become because of it. I'd read once that the first version of yourself that shows up after a betrayal is rarely the version you want to keep, and I believed that enough to wait, to watch, to breathe through the nights I spent lying awake beside her, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing conversations I never had the nerve to start. That week was its own kind of torment. I went to work and sat through meetings I couldn't remember 5 minutes later. I nodded at things Chris said over email, short logistical exchanges about a project we were both technically still running together, and each message felt like handling something radioactive, my fingers hovering over the keyboard longer than they needed to. I didn't confront him either.
I wasn't ready.
I think some part of me was still testing the ground, checking whether the version of reality Maria had handed me could possibly survive contact with more information, hoping against all evidence that there was an explanation that didn't end where I already knew it was going to end. At home, I watched Rachel with the strange, clinical attention of someone conducting an experiment on their own life. I noticed things I'd been too comfortable to notice before, how she angled her phone away from me now, not dramatically, just a small habitual turn of the wrist. How she'd started taking calls in the garage with the door shut, telling me it was a work call, something about a client who only had evenings free. How, when I hugged her one night in the kitchen, holding on a beat longer than usual because I needed to feel something solid, she'd gone stiff in my arms before catching herself and softening, a half-second delay that told me more than any of Maria's words had. I thought about calling my brother. I thought about calling a lawyer. Instead, I called no one because saying it out loud to another person would have made it permanent in a way that sitting with it privately somehow didn't, and I wasn't ready to make it permanent yet. I needed, I think, to grieve the version of my marriage that still existed in the space between discovering the truth and speaking it, because I understood, in some instinctive way, that once I said the words out loud, that version would be gone for good, and whatever came next would be something else entirely. Maria came twice more that week, on her usual Tuesday and Friday schedule, and both times we exchanged only careful, ordinary pleasantries in front of Rachel, the two of us performing a normalcy that felt like its own small betrayal. But on Friday, as she was leaving, she caught my eye in the hallway for just a moment, and I saw in her face the same question I'd been asking myself all week. Are you going to be okay? I gave her the smallest nod I could manage, and she left without saying anything else, though I noticed she'd left a card tucked under a book on my desk. No note, just a small card for a therapist she said her sister had used years ago. I didn't call the number that week. I kept it anyway. By Sunday night, I'd run out of road. Rachel and I were in the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables for dinner with the easy, practiced motion of someone whose hands weren't carrying any weight, and I stood at the counter across from her and realized I couldn't do one more day of pretending the floor beneath us was solid. I need to ask you something, I said, and something in my voice must have carried more than I intended, because she set the knife down immediately and looked up at me, her face already beginning to shift into something careful and alert. What's wrong?
I didn't yell.
I want to be clear about that because I've thought about that moment so many times since, replayed it in my head like a scene I could still revise if I looked at it hard enough, and every time I land on the same fact. I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything, I didn't do any of the things anger is supposed to make you do. I just laid it out, plain and flat, the way you'd read a verdict handed down by someone else, someone with no stake in the outcome. I know about Chris, I said. I know he was here. Last Tuesday. In our bedroom. I watched something drain out of her face in real time, the color and the composure both, until what was left looked almost unfamiliar to me, a stranger wearing my wife's features. She didn't deny it. That was the thing I hadn't prepared for, somehow, even after a week of preparing for everything else. She didn't ask how I knew, didn't scramble for an explanation, didn't reach for any of the lies I'd half expected and almost wanted, because at least a lie would have given me something to be angry at instead of this flat, exhausted honesty that seemed to have been waiting inside her for a long time. I didn't know how to stop it, she said quietly, her hands still resting on the cutting board, unmoving. I didn't know how to tell you. I wasn't happy without breaking everything. So you broke it anyway, I said. You just didn't tell me. You let me keep living in a house that wasn't what I thought it was. She didn't argue with that either. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, and I watched her, still standing at the counter, feeling like the distance between us had become something physical, something you could have measured with a tape measure, 6 feet of tile floor that might as well have been an ocean. We talked for hours that night, longer than we'd talked about anything in months, maybe longer than we'd talked about anything real in years, and none of it changed the outcome. It just filled in the shape of how we'd gotten there. The slow drift that had started before Chris, if I was honest with myself, the nights we'd stopped reaching for each other, the conversations that had thinned out into logistics and schedules, the way we'd both let the relationship coast on momentum long after either of us had been steering it anywhere. Chris called twice that week, his name lighting up my phone screen with a casualness that felt almost obscene, as if he had no idea, as if he thought we'd just pick up the next project meeting like nothing had happened. I let both calls die into silence, watched the screen go dark each time with a strange, hollow satisfaction. He texted once, something vague about needing to talk, and I stared at it for a long time before deleting it without responding. There was a particular kind of grief in losing a marriage and a friendship in the same breath, I discovered, like 2 funerals happening at once, except everyone still expected you to show up to work on Monday morning and function like a normal person, answer emails, sit through meetings, pretend the ground hadn't shifted permanently under your feet. The following weeks moved in a blur I can only partially reconstruct now. There were conversations with lawyers, careful and clinical, dividing up a life into columns and spreadsheets. There were nights I stayed at a friend's place because the house had become unbearable, every room holding some memory I wasn't ready to sit inside of. There was one terrible dinner where Rachel and I tried, briefly and half-heartedly, to talk about whether there was anything left worth saving, and both of us knew within 20 minutes that there wasn't, that we were just going through the motions of trying, because it felt wrong not to try at all. I saw Chris exactly once more in the office, both of us caught off guard in the hallway outside the elevator. He started to say something, some opening syllable of an apology, and I just shook my head and walked past him. I dissolved the partnership within the month. It cost me money and time and no small amount of professional headache, untangling 2 years of shared contracts and clients, but I never once regretted it, not for a single day, because some things you can't keep doing business with, even when the business itself was never the part that mattered. Maria stayed on through all of it, coming twice a week even during the strange, in-between months when the house was half-packed into boxes and neither of us quite lived there anymore in any real sense. She never asked me for details, never pried, just kept showing up and doing the quiet, steady work of keeping some order in a life that had none, and I found myself grateful for her in a way that went far beyond what you're supposed to feel for someone you pay to clean your house. She'd been the one who told me not to go home that day, and in some strange, roundabout way, she'd also been the one steady thing that helped me find my way back to some version of myself once the house I'd been avoiding stopped being something to avoid at all.